Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's IAQ webinar organized by the Quality in Planet Earth Concerned think tank of the International Academy for Quality. My name is Soumya Rokgire. I'm a sustainability architect and academician, and I'll be moderating today's session. So let me begin by welcoming our speaker, Ben Kellard, for a much needed conversation on reimagining an economy that works for people and the planet. This conversation is especially timely. Across the world, there is a growing recognition that many of today's economic models have failed to respond to the interconnected challenges we face, from social well-being and inequality to environmental challenges and long-term resilience. Today's session invites us to step back and reflect on some fundamental questions. Does our current economic system truly serve people and the planet? And if not, what kind of economic system do we need instead? With that in mind, I would now like to introduce our speaker, Ben Kellard. Ben is a fellow at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and the Center for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity. He educates and advises senior business leaders, working closely with them to help align organizational purpose and strategy with the transition to a sustainable economy. His work spans board and executive teams of large multinational companies across a range of sectors, from food and construction to consumer goods. Ben has also contributed as part of the steering committee for the first national standard for sustainable, purpose-driven organization, which is now progressing toward becoming an international standard. Currently, Ben is working independently with global thought leaders and representatives from business, finance, and governments to co-create a shared narrative for an economy that serves people and the planet, helping leaders better understand the urgency of economic transformation and their role within it. Ben brings over 20 years of experience as an organizational development consultant, including 11 years with the International Not-for-Profit Forum for the Future, which strongly informs his practical and systems-oriented approach. Today, Ben will share insights from his ongoing initiatives and reflect on the role of key economic actors such as business and states in shaping and enabling this transition. And before we begin, just a quick housekeeping points. Today's session will include a 25 minutes presentation followed by a 10 minutes breakout and a 15 minutes Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions through the chat box at any time during the presentation, and we will do our best to address as many questions as the time allows. The recording of today's session will be shared with you in the coming days. With that, let's begin. Ben, the stage is yours.
Soumya, thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Great to be with you all, whichever part of the world you're in. I'm in the UK, just north of London, but it's great to be with you and to share some insights from some of the work I've been doing this year and last year. And as this quote suggests, Plato, I think, got it right, where we are essentially, I think, a storytelling species. You know, it's how we make meaning of the world around us. And those that craft and tell stories arguably rule the world, as Plato said. So I want to just delve a little bit into what stories do we tell ourselves about the economy and the lives we want. As Samir has mentioned, what I'll be doing is sharing with you sort of the why are we doing this project and what are the key insights. Before then, it'd be great to get some of your reflections in small groups, and then we can come back together as a group to share. So that's what we've got planned. So if I start off then, so why do we need a new narrative for a new economy? Well, as you've probably seen from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, every year they publish look at 9 different environmental boundaries, and we are exceeding 6 of the 9. So if we imagine driving a car and we had sort of 9 indicators and 6 of them were flashing, we'd probably pull over pretty quickly and take our car to a garage. But we're not as a species. In fact, we're putting our foot down on the accelerator. And you'll have probably seen the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report came out today, again showing that sort of both global instability and environmental overshoot are major risks. And of course, they're all interlinked as well. So I think what we know so far is we know we need urgent transformation. We have gone long past the kind of the opportunity for incremental change. We need transformation change as we are midway through the decisive decade, where scientists are, very consistent saying if we don't take decisions this decade, then it starts to feedback loops kick in, where we start to lose control over as we reach environmental tipping points. We also know that the current economy isn't working. I'd argue it's not really working for anybody, but I'll come on to that. Because we also know the systems we need to transform. So, like food, energy, built environment, and so on. We know the systems we need to transform, and we know no one economic actor can do that on their own. So, we can't just leave this to business or government. They all have a role to play in that transformation. We also know that old narratives about the economy are extremely well funded and organized and dominate, and often what George Monbiot calls the invisible doctrine. So it's like we've internalized narratives about the economy and our role in it over the last sort of 40 or 50 years. But it's also true that we don't have really a shared, clear, and credible alternative for what the economy could look like. And that's really where this piece of work comes in. And as a result, we lack what I call the imaginative scaffolding to imagine what would that economy look like, so we can start to begin to construct it and understand what are the role of different economic actors in that transformation so that we can all play our role, whether that's at a city level, at a national level, or looking at sort of value chains. And often what we end up talking about is if we think of a river analogy, we end up often talking about downstream effects like increase in carbon emissions, or we recently had a report just came out today from the insurance industry, Munich Re, saying that last year we spent $108 billion on natural disasters that are, happening. And we talk about inequality, cost of living crisis. But what we very rarely do is trace why we have those outcomes to our economy. What are the stories and beliefs we tell about ourselves? How does that shape structures and policies and incentives that then shape culture and behaviors through all of our institutions and sectors and then deliver those downstream effects? We rarely connect all the dots on that. And so that's really, again, what we're looking to do is surface that to both understand how their current economy works, when only about a third of people feel comfortable knowing how the economy works, and then also what the alternative might be. And really, the purpose of that is if we think of the bell curve of the population, when we have leaders on the right hand side, we have laggards on the left, but then we have this majority in the middle. It's like, how do we engage that sort of early majority through the use of narratives and visions and so on, so that we can start to create those sort of social tipping points and move our systems towards an economy that delivers for everybody. And I would argue that there's loads of stuff happening on the new economy. The area I know best, sustainable business, there's work being done on sustainable finance, there's being work done on post-GDP metrics and so on, about the role of the states. Think of the work of Mariana Mazzucato. But often we lack the picture on the top of the box that makes sense of all those different parts of the jigsaw puzzle. And that's really what I want to inquire into today, is what might be that picture on the top of the box that connects and makes sense of all those bits of the jigsaw puzzle. So what I'd like to do is begin, if that's why we're looking at a project to look at shaping a shared narrative for a new economy, let's start with the sort of the structure of that narrative, which is what are those shared aspirations? What is well-being? Because often we're kind of led to believe that, well, there's 8 billion people and you'll get 8 billion answers on what well-being is. So just leave it to the individual to decide what's best for them. That's the kind of narrative that we've been sort of brought up with in the West. But actually what the evidence would suggest is that both through conversations and research, that what most people want is incredibly consistent over both time and geography. So most people, not surprisingly, want to feel secure and part of healthy communities. They want meaningful and fairly paid work. They want to have time to spend with loved ones and lead a fulfilling life on what's often called the, art of life. They want access to nature, clean air, clean energy, clean water and housing, and have healthy food and affordable food. And they want to feel secure and optimistic about the future, and the sense that things are improving for future generations. And while that doesn't maybe sound too much, they're not asking for 5 different cars, they're not asking for a house in the Caribbean. But unfortunately, the reality is that is very far from most people, even in high income countries. That reality feels very far away. So why is that? Well, let's look at the current economy and think about that sort of river analogy. Let's think about what are some of the downstream effects of the current reality, which I'm arguing is enough. And a lot of this is based on, you'll see in the top right corner, the upward shaped arrow, which is how we're sort of taught to think about growth and progress. Things are always up and improving and increasing and accelerating. That's what we're always told we want. But I want to kind of, and that's this assumption. I think the reality is that most people feel that their personal values are in conflict with often the behaviors they have to spend at work. They often have to leave themselves at the front door. They're exhausted. They feel time poor. They are anxious about the growing inequality in society and the fragmentation of society. They're worried about poor mental health. WHO recognise that depression is the leading kind of cause of ill health and loneliness. Also, we're seeing a lot of downsides of overconsumption and make, waste business products and services. The overconsumption is creating a lot of problems, and also real anxiety over climate and nature destruction. The bad news we're hearing on the all the time on the news, and also that for many in the first time, we're actually anxious about future generations. We're worried that the future generations, our children and grandchildren, will actually have worse quality of life than we are, is often, I think, the reality most of us are facing into. So if that's the downstream effects, if we go upstream, what are the causes of that? Let's surface the causes of that. And I'd argue that the reason for that is that there are three fundamental flaws with the assumptions about how the economy works. And the first is that we assume that well-being is money is a proxy for well-being, that money or GDP equals well-being. And the fact is, this overlooks the fundamental drivers of both human and the well-being of nature, which I'll come on to. It also overlooks market reliance, our reliance on putting the provision of market services into the market overlooks power dynamics and the influence of elites, and also the impact of putting things into the market, the impact it has on relationships, and so on. And the third thing, as highlighted by Professor Dasgupta, a Cambridge economist, points out in the Dasgupta report, that we fundamentally treat the economy as separate from ecology and nature. And so we ignore all of the environmental stocks and sinks. And so by focusing on GDP as the overriding goal, for example, we only value a tree, for example, when we chop it down and use it. We don't value the forests that are providing clean air recreation, flood resistance, and so on. We don't value any of that in our current economic model because it's not a product or service. And so even the founder of GDP, Kuznets, warned, do not use GDP as a proxy for well-being. And what is it we do? We use GDP as a proxy for well-being. So there's some fundamental flaws cooked into our underlying assumptions. And what that then does is that cascades down into institutions, incentives, and so on, which has the policies which tend to governments look to maximize growth because the assumption is more growth equals more well-being, whereas actually there's a lot of evidence showing the opposite is true. Also, that we want to maximize markets, so put more provision into markets and minimize the role of states because states are seen as incompetent. And financial institutions are there to maximize financial value because that, again, is assumed to increase well-being. And businesses, therefore, are there to maximize profits because that's meant to be an indicator of more well-being. That's the assumption, as we know only too well. So if that's a kind of the upstream, what does that mean midstream then? What does that mean for often businesses, particularly large listed businesses? It means they have to do three things if they want to maximize profits that ladders up to that GDP. They need to minimize labor for a start. So they want to maximize labor efficiency, which means minimizing pay and maximizing the amount of productivity from that labor. They also want to maximize sales because sales means profit. And so what that often means is that it's about pursuing volume, which often means driving overconsumption. It means built-in obsolescence or built-to-break products. And it means creating insatiable demand, even if that means undermining people's needs in order to sell them more stuff. And it also means the third thing they're required to do is externalize costs. So in other words, put costs onto nature and society, whether that's pollution, carbon emissions, pollution, or things like fueling obesity due to addictive food products that are high in sugars, fats, and with empty calories, for example. And also that includes minimizing tax payments to states. So that's what businesses are required to do, because if they don't, they'll very quickly go out of business because their competitors are. And these are the incentives we drive through the system. But that then cascades down and shapes, because productive production shapes societies, both on the supply side by shaping labor markets and on the demand side by shaping the products and services. It leads to these three outcomes of isolation, because people feel increasingly overworked in as transactional consumers. They often feel They're socially isolated. It builds in inequality as a result of that, and it leads to people feeling time poor and under a great deal of competition. It also builds in scarcity because of that focus on often external goods. It's about selling external goods, where actually all the evidence tells us that where true well-being comes from internal goods. So it comes from connection, relationship, self-mastery, and things like that. Where external goods are a means to an end, not an end in themselves. But our current economy is incentivized to deliver external goods. So that actually means it's not actually meeting human needs. And also, it creates material status anxiety and drives a cost of living crisis, which is driving up sort of production costs. But also, what it does, it leads to insecurity because it can lead to fragmented society, increased poor mental health due to competition and undermining of needs, and also anxiety around climate and nature crisis. So that's often, in reality, we get this sort of chain of logic. And as this isn't just businesses, but as more and more production is put into the market, it means that business is having a greater and greater influence on shaping society. So we move, as Mark Carney described, from a market economy to a market society. So what that does is that then sets up two reinforcing vicious circles. On the one hand, when we say money equals well-being, our kind of key flaw is that that then means businesses maximize profits, which then lead to minimizing labor, which leads to labor efficiency, whereas actually what we need is material efficiency. It leads to insatiable demand and putting costs onto nature, which then fuels the poly crisis of increased inequality, climate change, carbon emissions, and destroying nature, which is in direct contrast with true well-being, as I set out kind of earlier. And also, it leads to a fragile economy because it leads to a centralization of economic power, which influences political power, and it leads to very lean systems because no fats in the system because that's potential profit. So we have lean value chains, and we tend to have large centralized players, and that's the opposite of what you want for a resilient system. With a resilient system, you want a devolved system with decentralized, with some fat in the system for contingency. Meanwhile, states are incentivized to maximize growth because that's sort of the assumption is that means more growth, more GDP, more well-being. That often then means they need to reduce spending by limiting tax. But on the one hand, that means they also have to spend more on public services, and that's often because they have to clear up and deal with the negative effects of the poly crisis, which is often called defensive expenditure. So that would be things like dealing with mental health issues or clearing up pollution and so on. So that leaves states in a really a sort of a vice-like grip where often they lead to being indebted because they're caught between low taxation on the one hand and having to increase public spending on the other. So that's kind of the cycle I think that we can recognize in many of our current reality. And therefore, growth is not leading to well-being. In fact, growth is arguably accelerating the undermining of well-being, both for the planetary systems and for human well-being. So maybe now it's time, as we reach the middle of the decisive decade or past the midway point, to revisit some of these fundamental assumptions we've assumed for the sort of last 40 or 50 years, but without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because as Narcotics Anonymous suggests, insanity is repeating the same mistakes and expecting something radically different. And so rather than doing that, maybe it is time to fundamentally rethink our assumptions about how the economy works. But I hear you might be thinking, Ben, do you mean communism? That didn't work, right? Well, no. I mean, the reality is there is an alternative, but I think it's highly fragmented. And so what I want to put to you is the common ground amongst a lot of new economy thinking. Because if we can't imagine a new future, we won't be able to create it if we can't first imagine it. So last March, I convened around 30 both thought leaders who represent the range of new economy thinking, plus leaders from business, finance, and government. We had Scotland's chief economist, for example, chief economists of Triodos Bank, and so on. And these are really also thought leaders who are looking at economy, which first of all takes the premise it should serve everybody. So not just the 1%, not just the Northern Hemisphere, but everybody. It should deliver well-being for them, and they should be doing it within environmental limits. That's the kind of the assumption. And so that would include a whole range of thinkers from, you might have heard of donut economics, post-growth, degrowth, and so on. And so some of the people, for example, we had Ben Taylor came from Ernst & Young. They have a new economy unit, have published a lot of work on new economy. We've had Emmy Bidston, who's from the Harvard Flourishing Project, big research program there, looking at what is flourishing, and the Oxford Character Project, which is looking at character traits that lead to flourishing. We also had Professor Fergus Lyon from the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity. You might have heard of Tim Jackson and his work, and Gay Harrington, who's a US thought leader in this space. We had Joe Swinson, who's a former politician, runs a big sort of program, Partners for a New Economy, that is looking to transform new economy. We had leaders from the Welsh government who have got leading regulation on the Future Generations Act. We've got Catherine Trebeck, who's founder of the Economics of Arrival, also co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, that brings together thinking in this whole space. We've got Sophie Grittenberg, who's from an organization called Economy for the Common Good. We've got Till, who's from the Club of Rome, who set out in the 70s, early thinking on the limits to growth. And we also had Zhao Ting from the Donut Economic Action Lab. You may have heard of Donut Economics and Kate Raworth's work. And we also had leaders from industry as well, people who are really, used to working with the trade-offs and realities of business. We had former asset managers. We had, people from the leadership team of Vodafone, director of policy from the Confederation of British Industry, and so on. So we had some really people who, an amazing group of people. And what I want to share with you is what is some of the consensus we came up with around bringing together all of that new thinking and practice. What is it we came up with? Well, first of all, let's start downstream. What would it feel like to be in a new economy? Let's start there before we go upstream and see what causes it. And notice, rather than that upward arrow, this is about the infinity symbol. It's about what is regenerative, what is renewable that leads to true human flourishing. Well, imagine, if you will, where you have more time for loved ones and leading a fulfilling life. Yes, you would be working, but there'd be sort of better jobs, but shorter working week with more meaningful, because those jobs are delivering well-being outcomes. There would be less consumption, but higher quality products that last and are circular and net zero. There'd be a lot of innovation because productive capacity would be aimed towards well-being outcomes that within environmental limits, such as protecting nature and being net zero. There'd also be opportunity for greater public investment in genuine well-being economy, well-being outcomes, rather than clearing up the mess after the poly crisis. And they were able to invest in real, infrastructure to deliver well-being. And there'd also be less extreme inequalities. So this would still be differences between income and wealth levels, but not the extremes we face today. And there'd be very strong local engagement where local communities are really shaping their priorities and are being involved in delivering them. And there'd be access to healthy food and affordable food, clean energy, water, and housing. And so I realize that that almost feels like a fantasy. You might be saying, Ben, what have you been smoking? But stay with me. I want to take you through what would be the design of an economy. Well, first of all, if we go upstream, there'd be some fundamental shifts in how we see the role of the economy and people. So we'd recognize the assumption that people are part of nature and dependent on it and each other for their flourishing as well as their survival. And that well-being lies in flourishing relationships between people and between people and the natural world. And it recognizing that society is a complex system that's embedded within the natural world, not separate from it. And so that would then lead to this seeing the purpose of the economy is there to serve long-term well-being of people and the planet. That's what the purpose of the economy would be there to be, rather than growthism, growth for its own sake, with the assumption it leads to well-being. It would built in the delivering well-being. That would then lead to a virtuous cycle. It would kind of rewind those. So on the one hand, when we'd start with the state, would work with communities to set well-being goals and set. So what is the foundations of well-being based on that research and evidence about delivering healthy communities, education, health, and so on, and setting parameters they'd operate within. And that those parameters could be environmental limits, what would need to be, like being net zero, restorative of nature. It'd be things like the level of inequality society is willing to tolerate, but also things like the amount of advertising that would be used as well. That would then be used to shape and incentivize markets. So it's distinguished between macro and micro. So at the micro level, there'd still be competitive markets. There would still be supply and demand. The state's not going to tell you what to have for breakfast or what clothes to wear. There's none of that. You're making decisions as a citizen. But at the macro level, macro levels would be tilted and shaped by governments to ensure the delivery of those well-being goals. Just like markets are shaped today, think of all of the trillions of dollars that go into fossil fuel subsidies, for example. But the difference is they would be guided by democratic discussion and debate rather than being left to markets. That would then incentivize businesses to be purpose-led and find how they can contribute to well-being goals. And that in turn would mean that you're then aligning, unlike at the moment where there's structural misalignment between economic incentives and well-being, it would be aligned where economic incentives are aligned to well-being. Therefore, that productive capacity would be innovating and delivering true well-being goods and services, which in turn would mean that they're more meaningful to work for. People would be more incentivized to work for those companies and be more motivated. So it'd unlock a lot of human motivation as well and be more fairly paid because there's not that sort of inequality that's being driven into the labor market. That would then lead to actual well-being outcomes. So the actual well-being needs are met as opposed to what's profitable. So that's why in our old economy, we have, for example, an over-provision of luxury and an under-provision of things like housing and sanitation because they're not profitable. Whereas in this well-being economy market, you would have that alignment. So you would be having well-being goals would be met, leading to stronger communities and actually time for flourishing, human flourishing and behavior. And also we'd have stable climate and nature because we'd recognize it's a finite resource that needs to be protected within the economy, which would also lead to a stronger, more resilient economy because it'd be more diverse, it would be more devolved, you'd have a diversity of both provision across markets, the state, households and the commons would be delivering products and services as well as civil society. It'd also have devolved, you wouldn't have the same centralization of businesses and economic power, so it'd be more devolved, and you'd have more sort of fat in the system, which would be more resilient to shocks. Then states, on the other hand, would then be able to be both having shaped markets, be able to invest in public services that are really positively investing and driving positive partnerships with the market. So drawing on some of the think of Mazzucato, for example, where you'd have drive synergies, just like we saw in the US during the space program, is the example she used, which drove, based on a goal of putting a person on the moon, drove a lot of innovation and aligned goals between the public and private sector. That's what we'd see a lot more of in the service of those wellbeing goals. So that's kind of big picture how it'd work. And so, therefore, to summarize the role of key economic actors, civil society has a key role. Again, unlike today, where I'd argue a lot of the big major decisions are taken by the market, which means often key elites within those markets and oligopolies within those markets, it'd be brought back into the public domain through participatory democracy, which would complement representative democracies, would shape those well-being goals, which would also mean citizens genuinely feel part of the political system, and they would actually actively engage in delivering them as well. States would work closely with communities to shape those well-being goals, set parameters, and then structure markets to deliver them. Businesses would then be incentivized to innovate and deliver those products and services within, if you like, bounded markets. So rather than pure free markets, bounded markets. And then finance would be there to fund well-being economic activity in the real economy, as opposed to over 70% of finance today, which funds finance. It doesn't actually fund the real economy. So there would be the sort of fundamental shifts in the role of economic actors, which again, we need to understand that in order to see how a new economy would work. And in the report, which I'll drop a link in the chat, we unpack in more detail, drawing on best practice and the latest thinking. We look at the functions of each of those actors in a bit more detail. So that'd be based on principles that we agreed with what the Wellbeing Economy Alliance came up with, which is that the principles of a new economy then would be that institutions are there to serve the common good and create real value. In other words, protecting social, natural, and as well as not just focusing on financial value. It would also be based on participation. So it'd be people powered, where citizens really engage with their communities and shape markets and priorities. And they would look to deliver dignity for everybody, so that everyone can live in comfort and safety, where justice is at the heart of the economy and nature is treated as an indispensable dependency, which is restored and ensured to be safe for both inherently having value, but also as an input and output from our economy. So to summarize then, I think we'd see kind of three main shifts from the current economy, which relies on extraction. And because it relies on extraction, it leads to exploitation, externalities, and the extraction of both raw materials labor and finance, which leads, so rather than have one based on isolation, which are the outcomes that leads to, it leads to one of connection with communities and to nature, and give a sense of belonging. It moves from scarcity, where scarcity is built into the current economic model, is artificially created to increase inequality, drive cost of living crisis, and overconsumption. Instead of that, you'd have, and the focus on external goods, you'd have instead of focus on internal goods. There'd still be external goods, but there'd be more means to an end rather than end in themselves, which would lead to meaningful work, time for others, and having access to clean air and energy. And it moved from one of insecurity we have today, because it's undermining well-being, both human and natural well-being, and the future of viability of civilization, moving to one of stability and climate restoration, and a sense of growing prosperity for all and into the future. So there'd be the major shifts that we would see happening. And the final thing I'd say is that you might think, well, that's all fine, Ben, but this is a minority that think that. Growing evidence is showing the silent majority want this shift to a new economy. There's growing evidence that, globally, that in the sort of 80% of people want this. But interestingly, when they ask what they think their peers what views, they think that only 30 or 40% of people want this. But actually, it's showing that 80 or more percent people want the shift to a new economy. So actually, this is the majority, but it's a silent majority. So I covered a lot of ground, and hopefully you can see where I realize you might feel, well, what does this mean for quality? Well, of course, quality is all about what is the delivery, not just of the quality of the product, but what is the quality of the outcome of those. And what I'm hoping you can see here is we've looked at what are the kind of fundamental assumptions that lead to incentives in our economy that then drive businesses to deliver the kind of products and services they deliver. So we've zoomed out a bit, but that's what I'm inviting us to consider. So what we're going to do now is get into some breakout groups to maybe reflect on, go with where the energy is, but some reflection questions you may want to consider are what resonated with you when I shared the principles and the narrative, or indeed the diagnosis of the current economy. What resonated? You thought, yes, that's kind of put its finger on something I feel. But also, is there anything you disagreed with or you think is missing from the kind of the diagnosis or the proposal? And the other thing you might want to consider is how might the narrative or principles and practice inform your own work and practice? So there are just maybe some things you may like to consider as we move into breakout groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was truly a thought-provoking discussion. And just let's move on to the breakout rooms to have the comments and feedbacks from our participants. So Ray, if you could please just create the rooms. And how many rooms can we have? What could be the number of people in each room? What do you suggest, Ben, for the discussion?
I think if we maybe have maybe 5 or 6 groups, something like that. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We can-
Maybe we can have like five one. Let me see. That's right. Just to recreate.
Yeah. Whichever's
Okay.
easiest. Thanks, Ray.
Yeah. I can open it right now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Like for how much time again? Somi?
15 minutes or 10, Ben,
But
you tell
if
us.
we say 10 minutes, yeah, should we
10 minutes.
say? Yeah.
Okay.
Back a
Oh, okay.
quarter to the hour, I think. Yeah. Thanks.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
They will be back in 3 minutes or almost done in the breakout rooms. We still have around like 2 minutes. So they will be back right here in the main room. They will be back in 1 minute right here in the main room. Okay, they will be here in 30 seconds. All right. Hello, Willie. Happy New Year.
Okay, Ray, I was just talking to myself. I was muted. I was talking to you, but technically you couldn't hear me. So I was just thinking, oh, hi everyone. And so I was just thinking of kind of a minor change. So instead of having Q&A, how about to have a plenary meeting, as Ben said, and having the audiences to share their comments here and then to have a discussion. So what do you think?
Sounds good. I mean, should we, how about people maybe you use the reaction to say if they want to come in somewhere? Does that sound good? And then it'd be
Yeah.
lovely to hear people's reflections and maybe if you've got a question, but equally, we would love to hear your reflections on the conversation you had. So yeah, do you want to put a hand up virtually or using the
Yes.
reaction or a
Yeah,
physical hand?
please just raise your hand, the ones that you wanna just share, and then we will go through that. Willie, do you want to be the first one? Because we had some.
Sure, sure. I was still looking how to raise my hand, but in
Okay,
that case, I don't
I
need
did
to do.
that for you.
I don't
Okay,
need. I
amazing.
don't need to do that. Great. Yeah. Well, as we were just saying in the breakout room, there were two specific things that I noticed, and the one was about creating the measurements, replacing GDP, so to speak, with a set of better focused measurements, of which I think some already exist. I mean, there are some systems that have been developed about well-being, about happiness in a country, and that sort of thing. So that's one thing that I think it would be good to create a set that has a sort of a general acceptance. Work on that. And the other thing I noticed was more your final comment, Ben, when you talked about there's a silent majority who really wants that. I think one reason why there is still silent is that there also a lot of fear from the point of view, the problems we know are safer than the problems we don't yet know. So, people are hesitant to change. But what I was thinking about is that actually um, a major task would be marketing. Actually, marketing whatever system comes out of that, almost using well, I'm not a marketeer, but almost using all the marketing tools that are out there to have people buy stuff they don't really need. It might be a good thing to use that to create systems for that people would get a better life.
It's a really
That
good
were the
point.
main points I
No,
noted.
that's great. And just to pick them up, so you're right, there's a lot of work being done on post GDP metrics, and it's really maturing very fast. There's a very strong evidence base. Quite recently, a group basically came together to look at a synthesis because it's sort of it's going from divergence to convergence, like a lot of things do in maturity. And they've now got it down to about 20 consistent indicators. And so the idea is it's a bit more you're being used in business to the idea of a dashboard. It's more like that. So it'd be more like you have a dashboard. And some of those might be emphasized more in some economies than others, right? So, depending on the nature of your economy, where you are in the world, what natural assets you've got. But it's likely to be similar things like education, health indicators, soil health. There are likely to be some quite consistent metrics that really reflect the evidence-based drivers of human and natural well-being. So I think we're pretty close to getting that in a robust place. I think the challenge I think you're right, we do need a new narrative. And I think that as a purpose-driven social storytelling species, not having a narrative is a big problem. And because it coalesces, I think, energy, it creates legitimacy, it creates something to go after. But also, I think calling out why the current system doesn't work. Like we really do have to move beyond lazy thinking, like, oh yeah, GDP works well. Like the one thing that's not questioned in the UK, for example, is no one questions we need more GDP, where all the evidence is telling us why do we need more GDP? So anyway, so there's some of those things we really need to call out as well. But I think the challenge with reorientating marketing is we have to be honest about because we have that centralization of economic power in pretty much every industry now, right? Every industry is pretty much an oligopoly. That includes media. So our media is shaped by those elite interests, but also those companies, it's not in their interest to deliver well-being outcomes. It's in their interest to sell more stuff, and that's part of the problem. So I think that's why I don't think companies are going to voluntarily do that. As somebody once said, at the end of the day, McDonald's aren't going to voluntarily sell less hamburgers, right? So I think that that's why we've kind of called out and said it really needs that relationship between civil society. So closing the massive democratic deficit we currently have in our economies, setting out what those well-being goals are to then set the parameters and incentives for markets, which will then incentivize businesses to do that. But there is that tipping point. You're right. In how do we start to I think, create the sense that there's the clarity, provide the clarity, confidence, and courage to move towards a new economy. That, I think, is what we need to even begin to start to do that, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this piece of work. And remember, what I'm not suggesting is anything new. What I'm really doing is just pulling together what is already out there. I'm taking no claims of originality here whatsoever. This is all evidence based that's out there. The other thing I'd say is that also the fundamental assumptions that drive our economy are largely disproven now. Like there's almost very little evidence. In fact, they were founded on very thin evidence in the first place. Some of the fundamental assumptions we hold about the old economy. So we need to call that out a lot more. We've now got extremely strong evidence base for what a new economy can look like. We're just not using it. And I think partly because it's partly a lack of understanding, partly we don't have the narratives, but also it's about power relations. Let's be quite honest about it as well. But thanks, Willie. Great reflections there. And also what I'll do is I'll pop a link in the chat in the meantime to the report, which goes through this in a bit more detail. But I'd love to hear. So there are those kind of growth dependencies. And part of that, I think, is about reshaping the political debate. And as I say, challenging politicians who are, frankly, falling back on, as I say, outdated, assumptions about who they're serving and how they're serving it. But also what we're putting out in this is a very different new way of thinking about how states and markets work together. Too often we see in political debates really outdated policy instruments that people reach for. Things like, for example, they go straight to income tax. Well, for example, two questions. First of all, I don't know if you realise, income tax was invented by the British government to pay for the Royal Navy in the 18th century. That's how old income tax is. And why are we taxing goods rather than bads? Think about we charge value added tax. We're taxing value that has been created in the economy. We're taxing income. Why aren't we taxing bads like like pollution, for example, carbon? So there are some fun. We need to think very differently and look at all the work of Mariana Mazzucato about how, again, private and public sectors can work really well together and amplify their impact and so on, which crowds in investment, pulls in the right level of investment and innovation. All these different ways of thinking. Most politicians are not reaching for these new policy instruments. They're reaching for, in many ways, hundreds of years out of date policy instruments. So I think we do need to really think a lot more fresh. And at the moment, I'm not sure who's educating our politicians on that. So I think in the end, we're leaving them with, we're not giving them the arguments, we're not giving them the instruments and the solutions. And what my experience of working with politicians and people that advise me is they need solutions ready to go. They haven't always got time to do the heavy thinking. They want policy, instruments ready to go. And a lot of those are there, but I think we lack the narratives to really equip them with them and to help shape that political debate. So I think Sergio's raised a really good point there. Any other kind of reflections or questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. So, okay, David.
Yeah. Did you? Yeah.
Hi, Ben. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
Yeah, great. Yeah, in our conversation, sort of it landed very well. There's a good base, obviously, to work from. The one question that came up was around most of it, 99% fully agree with. The one bit I was just a little bit when we said that the current system benefits no one, and you've talked about this a little bit just earlier, that actually it does benefit a very, very small minority with a great deal of money and a great deal of power and the ability to buy power. And you mentioned about this power play. So obviously one of the things will be, about the barriers to change, and obviously throwing out the whole thing, the baby out with the bathwater is unlikely. So there'll always have to be some level of transition. Just from a risk point of view, they won't dump out what they've got now completely for something completely new, but they'll want to see a de-risked transition plan. So it'd be interesting your thoughts on that, and particularly adding to that, another comment that came up was around the tech and AI. This is a critical decade, and one of the things that is also coming into play is the real emergence of AI for potentially malevolent and benevolent use. And so just would be interested in your thoughts on those sort of areas, if you can.
Thanks, David. Really love it. Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. So when I was saying it's not working for anyone, I think that you're right. Although it's there to work in the interests of the minority, I've worked with some of those sort of billionaires. We run programs at CSL for what we call multi-generation programs, help them educate, understand the influence they have. And the reality is, I think even the billionaires aren't winning out of this. So because we know they tell themselves that money doesn't make them happy, and we know that from the evidence as well. So they're not made happy as well. So they're not winning. The rest of us aren't winning because we're kind of hamsters on the treadmill that's spinning ever faster. And you're right in that AI and technology is actually hollowing out the middle class as well. So we end up with this kind of hourglass economy with jobs at the top and jobs at the bottom and none in the middle. So we're kind of ever running faster because we're labor to be squeezed harder and harder. So it's the kind of earn more, spend more economy, right? So we're not winning, and the planet's certainly not winning because we're liquidating it for financial value, right? So that's what I think we're in a lose situation. And I think then in terms of the transition, yeah, you're right. There are fundamental barriers. There's a lot of vested interests, and I think part of the challenge, as somebody once put it, is that those that are going to win are largely don't have power, are faceless, nameless. Like we know who would win in a well-being economy. It would be the Southern Hemisphere. It'd be people in the lower and middle classes. It'd be the planet. And they don't have the power in the current economy. And those in the current economy know exactly who's going to miss out, right? And so they have all the power and a lot of the money. So there's a real asymmetry. And that's one of the reasons why, because we have this structural misalignment between what the productive capacity of the economy is incentivized to deliver and true well-being is leading to that asymmetry. You're right. So I think we do absolutely, as you say, need to de-risk the transition. And actually, the point I'd add is that I think the risk here isn't between necessarily the current extreme form of capitalism we have, because a lot of people will lead you, the part of the narrative today is, oh, this is capitalism, as if there's only one type of capitalism. It's not. This is just one type of it, right? And it's not communism. We're talking about the well-being economy. I actually think the alternative is actually an autocracy. So I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a move back towards 1930s big man politics, and it shows how short our memories are. Because a lot of that came out of the crash in 1930s, which again was because we only valued financial value. We left it all to the markets, and as historians show, that's usually when bad stuff happens. So our memories are quite short here. So I think actually the risk is autocracy is a very real risk. And there's research at LSE which shows that actually extreme capitalism and communism have the same pathologies because they have the same underlying logic, which is that you can control and predict how a system operates. It has a fundamental which is wrong. Whereas what a well-being economy moves beyond that and says, no, systems are more like ecosystems than machines. So it has a fundamentally different approach, and that's why they're both flawed, if you like. So back to your point, I think the risk is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater and we just throw out markets altogether, and move to autocracies, which is very rapidly where we don't have to spell out which countries and regions are moving that direction. Whereas I think what a well-being economy does is it takes the best of both worlds. It says, yes, markets have a really important role to play, but so do democracies. And let's be really clear who it's serving and why. Let's be really clear on the purpose, and then let's orientate our means towards it. So yeah, I'd really agree with your points there. And I think finally on AI and technology is ultimately a means, it's not an end, and so it will serve whatever system it's put into. And what concerns me is the incentives in the current system. We know exactly who will benefit. It will be like pouring petrol on the fire of the current economic system. And so where it could deliver really great outcomes if it was dropped into an economy with the right systems and the right governance. And I think we're a long way from that at the moment. But I think therefore it comes back to those same principles. How do we bring it into the public domain? How do we bring in proper public debate about it, and then structure markets? Because we have a history of doing that. We do that with pharmaceuticals. Why can't we do that with AI? And so on. So yeah, I thanks, David. Lovely, great reflections. I realise we're sort of cantering towards time. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversations, but Soumya, I'll maybe pass over to you to take us home.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. This has been a very rich discussion, and I wish we had more time to continue just talking about this and exploring this. ideas together. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Personally, I found the session very thought-provoking, offering new perspectives on how we can think about the economic systems, leadership, and the role each one of us can play in shaping what comes next. And we hope this conversation has also given you something to reflect on and take forward in your own work and thinking. So to stay connected and learn about the upcoming IAQ webinars, please follow the International Academy for Quality on LinkedIn. The link has also been shared in the chat, and the recording of today's session will be shared with you. Also, to help us improve our future webinars, we have also shared a feedback survey in the chat. Your comments and suggestions are very helpful to us as we continue refining these initiatives. Thank you again, and I wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Thank you, everyone.